February, a band of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay began a hunger strike. According to U.S. officials, 84 prisoners are on hunger strike currently. 16 of them are being force-fed, while 5 have already been hospitalized. In a recent New York Times column, one Guantanamo detainee, who's been there for 11 years without trial, gave a harrowing personal account of his experience. He says, quote, "I will never forget the first time they passed the feeding tube up my nose. I can't describe how painful it is to be force-fed this way. I wanted to vomit, but I couldn't. I'd never experienced such pain before. I would not wish this cruel punishment on anyone." Well, many of the detainees who are starving themselves are of the 86 prisoners who've already been cleared for release, but they haven't been permitted to leave. So to break down what hope these prisoners do have of walking free again, I'm joined now by Colonel Morris Davis, former chief prosecutor at Guantanamo Prison. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure.
So you were the chief prosecutor for the military tribunals at Guantanamo, and you resigned in 2007. Why?
Well, at that point, Guantanamo had been open for about 5 years. We'd yet to conduct, we'd done one trial, which was David Hicks, which had been fixed by Dick Cheney and John Howard in Australia. And I was being pressured by people above me that said, President Bush said we don't torture, so who are you to say that we do? And all the evidence we obtained by torture, you need to be using at trial. And to me, that's just fundamentally un-American, and I quit.
Well, speaking of torture, let's talk about the hunger strike. I mean, the UN has labeled force feeding of prisoners a method of torture. How is it that the U.S. can have total disregard for international law in this regard?
Yeah, we're really good at preaching to others about their behavior, but not very good at practicing ourselves. So, we condemn other countries for doing the things that we do. So we just ignore the UN. There was a report recently on drone strikes. There was one about waterboarding and torture in the past, and now this one about Guantanamo, and we just tend to ignore it. But the U.S. is kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't position. If they let the detainees starve themselves to death, then they'll be, oh my God, the detainees are dying. If they force feed them, then they're condemned for abusing them physically. So it's a no-win situation, because we've created this legal black hole where we let people sit for over a decade and just abandon them.
You've said, quote, President Obama doesn't have the balls to close Gitmo. To make it very clear for our viewers who are saying that Obama can't do this, his hands are tied, could Obama single-handedly close down this facility if he wanted to?
Well, he's the commander-in-chief. He was very impassioned last week about the gun bill. It'd be nice to see a little of that passion for Guantanamo, because that was one of the promises he made in 2008. And the first thing he did after the Lilly Ledbetter Act in 2009 when he took office was sign the order to close Guantanamo. And at the time, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. Right. Now, certainly the right-wingers, the wingnuts, have made it hard for him to close Guantanamo now, but he had kind of that sweetheart period where, had he really been committed, he could have done it, and he let the opportunity pass.
Well, certainly, and it was one of his the main pillar of his talking points when he was in the 2008 election. I mean, we wanted to see that closed. To play politics in a time like that, when you're putting so many human lives at risk of not having a fair trial, is really, frankly, unacceptable to me. What forces are keeping the camp open right now, other than, I guess, the most extreme right-wingers who are calling to keep it open?
Well, that's primarily it. I mean, what's in it for the U.S.? And we commit about 1,600 troops to guard 166 people at a time when we're trying to draw down forces and do more with less. You saw recently General Kelly, the commander of SOUTHCOM, told Congress he needs an extra $250 million to rehab Guantanamo to keep it open, on top of the $120 million a year we spend just on operating costs. So we're spending about 28 times more per person to keep them at Guantanamo than we do in federal prison. We've shot our credibility in the foot around the world. China just came out with a human rights report that condemns the U.S. for Guantanamo. Russia, Putin just recently barred some officials from travel to Russia. That included a couple of commanders from Guantanamo. So we lecture other countries about their human rights record, and they can consistently say, hey, what about Guantanamo? So there's nothing in it. I mean, legally, we've been trying for almost 11 years now to get these people into court. More people have died at Guantanamo than have been convicted at Guantanamo. The ones that have been convicted, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal court here in Washington, has overturned the convictions, saying they're not legitimate law of war offenses. So I just don't see what the upside is to keeping Guantanamo open, other than some talking points for the right-wingers who want to look like they're tough on terrorism.
And that's not even to mention the dry boarding, those quote, suicides that are really presumed to be actual murders in that sense. But let's talk about these talking points that we do hear to justify keeping the prison open. I mean, over half of these prisoners are already cleared for release. But we hear that other countries won't take them. There's nowhere to try them. I mean, cut through some of this rhetoric. What's the real truth here?
Well, essentially, the bulk of the ones that have been cleared, I mean, these are people that the CIA, Department of Justice, FBI, Department of Defense have said, we've reviewed their cases. They're not a threat to the U.S., and we don't want to keep them. But they sit in Guantanamo because of their citizenship, and most are from Yemen. And our argument is we don't trust the Yemeni government to be responsible for them. But that's the same government we said the Yemeni government gives us permission to conduct drone strikes and kill people. So on one hand, we trust the Yemeni government to let us kill people, but we don't trust the Yemeni government to take their own citizens back.
So basically, the administration seems to have no real interest in shutting this down. As you just said, that we've authorized millions of dollars to expand it and keep it in place. What are we supposed to do to help these prisoners who are killing themselves right now to get their message across?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it takes those kind of drastic steps to get people to pay attention when you've spent a decade of your life in confinement because of your citizenship. I've got a petition coming out on change.org that I'm working with them and with Witness Against Torture to put up a petition to encourage President Obama to remember what he promised 5 years ago and to keep his word and to close Guantanamo and let's end this black hole that we've had for over a decade.
And because this has been so politically bad for Bush and then Obama, even though people seem to have forgotten that he said that he was going to close it, right. It seems like the U.S. is now opting to just kill suspected militants abroad instead of capturing them. I mean, is this just the new policy because of how bad this detention facility has kind of been a scar on the administration?
Well, it's been, hopefully that's not the policy. I mean, if the U.S. has gotten to the point where killing people is easier than confining them, that's a sad commentary. But lately, the last couple of cases, like the Boston bomber, is going to be held in federal confinement, prosecuted in federal court. Abu Ghaith, bin Laden's son-in-law, is being held in federal prison, prosecuted in federal court. Hamza al-Masri, we had to promise, the UK, our closest ally, in order for them to extradite him to the U.S. for trial, we had to promise two things. We wouldn't take him to Guantanamo. We wouldn't prosecute him in a military commission. So it's kind of a statement about what our allies think about Guantanamo.
Certainly not a popular facility. We definitely need to see it closed. Thank you so much for coming out, being vocal against it, Colonel Morris Davis. Appreciate your time.
Sure.